Okay, our third panelist is Dr. Rosamond Hooper-Hamersley, honors coordinator of the New Jersey College City University. I'm sorry. Of course, because we're being recorded, I can't speak. So the honors coordinator of the New Jersey City University, the College of Arts and Sciences program, assistant professor in the history department, and her first book was published in 2011, The Hunt After Jean-Antoinette de Pompadour, Patronage, Politics, and the Art of the French Enlightenment. She's now working on Mercy Otis Warren, An Unvarnished Path to Virtue and Liberty, and right now she's focusing on women in the French Resistance. Today's paper, Les Périls de la Résistance, Lucie, Aubrac, and the Libération-Sud. And I think... Un moment.
This is you, right, Zoe? Is this yours?
No, mine's that's mine.
Oh, okay, sorry. Oh, wait. Oops, sorry.
Make sure it comes up.
Yeah, okay. Oh, wait, where's this thing? Am I good? It's good? I would want to just say something really quickly, and this often happens when you write a paper. The title halfway fits to what I'm writing. It's really about Mercy Otis Warren. I'm just kidding. Les Périls de la Résistance, yes, but it's not so much about her work with her cell, because what happened for me as I continued to work on it is there is what is known as, and I will deal with it substantively all the way through, the Aubrac problem. And I spent, interestingly enough, a week in Lyon this summer and continued to work, and Susan and I are quite good friends, and we continued sort of together to discover sources. Susan Suleiman has written something called Crisis of Memory, and Frazine Banerjee has talked about rethinking memory, a lieu de mémoire. And so for me, looking at the Résistance through the prism of Lucie Aubrac as I do, I'm doing so through memory. I mean, it's important what she did with the cell, but it's primarily the reclamation of history. Is this good? Elie Wiesel writes, "For in the end it is all about memory, its sources and its magnitude, and of course its consequences." This paper addresses the nuanced and complex role of memory in the Résistance through the prism of Lucie Aubrac. Aubrac's contested recollections as a résistant with the cell Libération-Sud became fodder for critics, from Jacques Verger, lawyer for Klaus Barbie, tried for crimes against humanity in 1987, to a round table of historians in 1997, including Henri Rousseau, who placed the memories of Lucie Aubrac and her husband Samuel on trial. Between territorial historians and empirically driven journalists, the province of accepted historical accounts, memoir and diaries in particular, has become a prickly, disputed space. Hannah Diamond and Claire Guerrara discuss the proprietary nature of witnessing within the French historical community. Deeply rooted ambivalence surrounds the nature of witness testimony and the claims of resistors in shaping the realm of memory. The subject, indeed, is a slippery slope. Does Aubrac have legitimate intellectual rights? Should witnesses, Hannah Diamond and Claire Guerrara ask, be allowed to own and shape public narratives of resistance? For Madeleine Méric Foucault, resistance signified, quote, the beatings, the humiliations, the tortures. I should have to resist. Resisting torture was what resistance meant, unquote. Decisions, she observes, are born of instinct. There was no guidance or protection and no alternative but to plunge forward. The challenge for historians, myself included, is to get out of the way of their subjects long enough for their voices, even potentially fallible, to be heard as we address context, purpose, bias, subjectivity, significance, and perhaps most difficult to measure, the nature of truth. Resistance thrives on collective action to remain formidable in the face of raw evil. Something larger than ourselves seeks nobility when all else seems mute and perfidious. For the Aubracs, Résistance became an unequivocal choice between conscience and defeat. Our destiny, she writes, became clear: to participate in the creation and development of a resistance movement, unquote, on behalf of family in France. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, and the head of the Gestapo, arrested Raymond Aubrac, Jean Moulin, and other members of their cell on 21 June 1943 during a clandestine meeting at the surgery of Dr. Dugoujon in Carouire, a Lyonnais suburb. The subsequent rescue of Aubrac, Moulin, and 13 other prisoners, orchestrated by Lucie Aubrac with members of the Libération-Sud on 15 October 1943, became the moment on which all else turned. Raymond Aubrac and his fellow prisoners had been incarcerated at Montluc prison in Lyon until their October rescue. In that time, Raymond endured hours of torture at the Military College of Lyon, commandeered by the Gestapo during the occupation. The Centre d'Histoire de la Résistance et de la Déportation in Lyon is now housed there. It is a solemn place, most particularly the chilling aesthetics of the basement, which eerily recall scenes of sadistic torture. There you go. No. Lucie Aubrac's publication on her work at Libération-Sud made her fair game, critics claimed. Memory as an historical tool was defied. Aubrac has drawn deeply on memory, most particularly the decision to rescue her husband and members of their cell, for freedom and dignity, for a rejection of racism and Nazism. For these, she writes, quote, "we fought to the end," unquote. Post-war, she wrote La Résistance, Naissance et Organisation, a comprehensive historical analysis of underground activity. In 1985, she published Il Patron dans l'ivresse, written in the form of a journal intime, and subsequently translated as Outwitting the Gestapo. Lucie recalls the terrifying year of May 1943 to February 1944 and attempted raids to free her husband and fellow members of their cells. She stated bluntly, "I did not write a history book with a big H, but a book in which I told of a pregnancy and a life." She was pregnant when all of this was going on. The title refers to the Aubracs' escape under the cover of darkness to London on 8 February 1944. They will leave with joy, or they will be drunk. Conversations with Corinne Bouchou, historian and senator of Maine-et-Loire, concerns Aubrac's wartime experiences and her role as a teacher. Doubts were ultimately sown, Donald Reed has observed, about the nature and memory of resistance by post-war generations. Skeptics question the revelatory power of the resistance as central to the reported Vichy syndrome. Reed avers it is possible to contest the ability of who may lay claim to the story of the resistance, from resistors to investigative journalists, academic historians, and the courts. We can debate historical claims through memory and competing claims to legitimacy. Aubrac counters, "I have tried to tell things as accurately as possible. I was helped in this effort by my own memory, that of my husband, and the testimony of our comrades." Primo Levi observes in Survival in Auschwitz that survivors write so others can participate in their experiences of, quote, "an interior liberation," unquote. And of his memories? "It seems to me unnecessary," he tells us, "to add that none of the facts are invented." Two cardinal events precipitated Aubrac's decision to position her 1985 narrative, Outwitting the Gestapo, in the pivotal year of 1943. The first, the 1984 release of Claude Ball's film, Que la vérité est amère, The Bitter Truth, propelled the resistance of the Aubracs, Lucie in particular, into dangerous territory. Ball's film challenges, in part, the conventional narrative of René Hardy, a résistant with a cell combat, as the man who gave up Jean Moulin to Klaus Barbie and his minions. This scandalous film, Aubrac responds, was designed to, quote, "discredit the resistance," unquote. Ball accused Raymond Aubrac of betraying Jean Moulin to the Gestapo. received wisdom but not empirical evidence holds that René Hardy, a Résistance activist, served up his compatriots to Barbie. As Diamond and Guerrara observe, Hardy is generally believed to have betrayed the meeting to the infamous Klaus Barbie, but this has never been proved, even though Hardy was twice tried as a Gestapo informer at the Liberation. Aubrac observes, according to the Mouvement de Résistance Les Mieux and their leadership, including Claude Brodet of Combat and Eugène Claudius Petit of Franc-Tireur, that Hardy was suspect. Hardy is in the hands of the Gestapo. This considerable danger, she writes, must disappear. The second event was the arrest of Klaus Barbie on 19 January 1983 in Bolivia, and his extradition to Paris and his impending trial held in 1987. I will say really quickly that as you go through these cells in Montluc, all their pictures are in the cells that in which they were held. Barbie was the last prisoner at Montluc. He was in this cell, it's like 6 rows down, but they put his picture on the opposite side of the wall from where all the others in all their cells are, so that you understand that he comes at the end of it. Lucie and Raymond Aubrac serve as witnesses in the trial of more than 900 hours of testimony, which focused on the nature of crimes for which Barbie could be tried. After protracted legal arguments, the option of war crimes was dropped in lieu of crimes against humanity. The specific charges levied against Barbie were founded upon, in part, the deportation of the Jewish children of Lisieux. Barbie, though he rejected the charge at his trial, was accused of masterminding a raid on the orphanage, kidnapping 44 children and their 7 supervisors. The first stop was Drancy, from which the children were subsequently sent to Auschwitz. Leah Feldblum was the sole survivor, leaving a small handful, Susan, just one more, to die at the hands of a firing squad in Estonia. Through the literal and figurative lenses of Barbie's lawyer and apologist Jacques Verger and the filmmaker Claude Ball, Barbie sought to discredit the claims of Lucie Aubrac in the rescue of her husband, as well as to paint them both as Gestapo informants. It was they, not René Hardy, they claimed, who had framed Jean Moulin, and on their heads could be hung the responsibility of his death. Philip Golub finds that, quote, Jacques Monsieur Verger has become the issue in the Lyon trial. He has attempted to transform the trial of a leading Nazi war criminal into an attack against French society in general and the non-communist branches of the resistance in particular, unquote, seeking further to proclaim the innocence of Barbie in the matter of Jean Moulin's death. As Verger observed, quote, I practice défense de la rupture. My law is to be against all laws. My morality is to be against all morality. Unquote. Verger's libelous characterization, Donald Reed suggests, was a duplicitous attempt by Barbie to impair the severity of the Résistance. Barbie's rage was fueled in part by Lucie's successful prison rescue of her husband in Lyon. Moreover, he seethed over Raymond Aubrac's central role. I think there's one more, Susan. That's okay. Oh, well, we'll leave it there. That's fine. In exposing him in a 1972 documentary directed by Laurent Delahousse. This contributed, Barbie avowed, to his injudicious extradition from Bolivia in 1983. Delahousse recalled that the extradition defined, quote, the personality of Barbie and his lie in the light of history that made the man flee and change his identity, unquote. Donald Reed posits that, quote, Verger, having been found guilty later of defamation against the Aubrac for his statements in Ball's 1984 film, found it safer to speak through a dead witness at the trial in Lyon. Barbie claimed, these questions go back more than 40 years and I can't reply. I worked under my superiors. I harbor no hatred against these minorities. I never did, and I do not know hatred, unquote. Barbie claims legitimacy for his memory, a paradoxical move considering his condemnation of the Aubrac for theirs. The divisive work of Ball and the transparent trial of Klaus Barbie was followed by Gérard Chauvy's controversial 1997 publication of Aubrac Lyon 1943, 6 years after Barbie's death, which pivoted Lucie and Raymond Aubrac and the Libération-Sud into a grueling spotlight. Chauvy accused the Aubracs of double agency with the Germans, additionally slandering Lucie for questionable memory. he endeavored to ferret out how and by whom information was leaked to the Gestapo on that fateful day in Caluire. Despite his fastidious account, Chauvet opted not to interview the Aubrac or any of the other Résistants originally arrested with Raymond Aubrac, as Chauvet sorted through his chosen evidence and built a case against their story, and thus their version of resistance. As Julian Jackson shows, Chauvet's cobbled history unleashed what came to be known as the Aubrac affair. On 17 May 1997, at the bidding of the Aubrac, a round table of historians sat down to sift through the discredited Chauvet text, which included an appendix called the Barbie Testament, likely penned by Verger. At issue were discrepancies in the Aubrac record of resistance. The couple had called for the round table to address what Lucie indisputably perceived as a direct attack against the resistance. The Barbie Testament chronicled the official version signed by Klaus Barbie and submitted by Verger on 4 July 1990 was, she notes, the work of an old Nazi. Through the laborious efforts of his lawyer long after his, Barbie's, conviction for crimes against humanity, it was, quote, not a plea for pardon, but an attempt for posthumous revenge, unquote. The air was not cleared. Instead, the Résistants, Lucie and Raymond Aubrac, became the story in place of their dead persecutor, Klaus Barbie. The skeptical academics rejected the findings of Chauvet as implausible and contradictory, but then turned to the Aubrac, challenging the exactitude of their memories. Diamond and Guerrara discuss the overexposure of the Aubrac on a public stage. They cite Claude Berry's sympathetic dramatic film Lucie Aubrac as one example on encroaching on the territory of memory and history, a province, quote, some historians wish to preserve, unquote, adding fuel to the fire of the questioned purpose of these résistants. Diamond and Guerrara suggest this professional priesthood closed ranks around their historical claims. We can argue further that their zealous actions coveted the contested right to recall history. Yet eyewitness testimony is a particular kind of history. It is best described as a combination of forms, psychological, sociological, all within the context of historical experience. Personal witness is best judged by those who acknowledge the particularity of its essence. Perhaps the Aubrac were inviting a methodology that could not evaluate their work. Had the round table stepped back and agreed on the form of what they were analyzing, they would have seen that some methods of analysis were appropriate and others not. It may be misguided to expose a testimony, which is a very human document, to the same rigors one would apply to a factual chronicling of events. It is unrealistic to expect an intimate journal to produce forensic history. Having said that, it does not mean that a journal itself is without historical merit. It is simply a different kind of source. Pierre Vidal-Naquet finds that, quote, history's mode of selection functions differently from that of memory and forgetting, unquote. He writes of the Holocaust, determining that a history that, quote, did not integrate memory, or rather diverse memories, and which failed to account for the transformation of memories, would be a poor history indeed, unquote. Testimony and eyewitness accounts can be measured in appropriate ways as a nuanced form, not a fictionalized form of the truth. Diamond and Guerrara overstep when they dismiss Aubrac's journal as fictional. Things are more than just true or false. The full breadth of history is often revealed in the gray areas of human telling. This points to discovering the human truths about an era as they are represented by the residual effects on the human psyche. In the case of Lucie Aubrac, who chose to write a journal intime, quote, not a history with a big H, the question becomes what was the nature of her experiences as best she can recall, and moreover, what are the human consequences? On this basis, we can go back and condemn what happened, condemn someone like a Klaus Barbie. The goal is not to create an unblemished record of events, but to discover the human blemishes for what they might reveal. Alan Finkielkraut finds in the aftermath of the Barbie trial that Aubrac's chosen focus in outwitting the Gestapo was resuscitated history, making the past current. Corinne Bouchot asks her candidly, why did you feel the need to leave a written testimony? Has it survived the errors of your story? Aubrac is forthright In terms of the nature of her testimony and her decisions to form it as a journal intime, she states frankly that her amis résistants encouraged her to compose an historical treatise on their work, but in fact, the idea of archival work filled her with ennui. She arrived at the conclusion that a journal would allow her to draw upon specific memories without telling the entire story of the Résistance. In pressing Aubrac further about criticisms of inaccuracy, Bouchot was curious to know if Aubrac felt that her book survived, quote, the errors of memory. On what basis do we decide this when contested facts do not raise a red flag? Aubrac points out several errors. I'm not going to go through those because we have a time limit. Does memory, therefore, have a legitimate place in framing a narrative, such as the French Resistance? She felt that it gave an opportunity to Verger to lay this erroneous charge at her feet. I think he liked it, she writes. Is it, as Henri Rousseau suggests, quote, a field of memory, a living phenomenon, something that exists in a continual state of evolution? For historians, he continues, analysis is rooted in substantive scholarly digging and theoretical reconstruction. Historians are poised to deliver a reliable, durable fount of knowledge. Perhaps those who lived through the events, he argues, were reasonably subjected to a crisis of memory, born of the unfinished mourning of nightmarish trauma, he imagines. Épuration légale did not expunge all ills or the potential distortion of torture that masked the events through the preponderance of eyewitness accounts. Might there be indisputable claims to contribute to the ongoing historical conversation? Guerrara suggested Aubrac made her epistolary choice with firm purpose. Her goal on the eve of the ignominious Barbie trial was to demonstrate the risks of a life of a résistant. Aubrac reminds us record-keeping was antithetical to résistance dangers. Eliminating the option of archived sources to be plumbed later, evidence was often chewed up and swallowed and choked down. Because, she writes, of my deep involvement in the Underground War, keeping a diary was out of the question. That, however, is the form that I want my narrative to take. Reed returns to the notion of identity, and thus the act of witnessing, most critical of all to Aubrac. For her, he states, the essence of France was the resistance. The pain of those years, extended by the potential loss of, quote, collective memory of the occupation, to understand the resistance as a revelation of France, and with such as a revelation of French women. The delayed horrors of the Barbie trial, the inquisitorial drubbing at the Round Table, yielded unforeseen outcomes, especially the contestation of memory. Paradoxically for Aubrac, the Barbie trial freed up the word liberty and, quote, facilitated the understanding for a whole world. Prior to the trial, schools had indicated muted interest in the Résistance. Perhaps it was a generational matter, she says. The trial raised interest exponentially. She returns to her unequivocal trope. We resistors belong to the past. For today's children, we are the conscience. Vera Laska writes of survivors ankle-deep in memories, women who bear an unwilling legacy imprinted on the cells of our minds, embedded in our heartbeats. We spread the word about the unbelievable. Aubrac concurs. This summer, I met with colleagues, this gentleman, Claude Bloch, now 85, then a 15-year-old boy who spent 3 days in hell at Montluc prison, stuffed inside a cattle-sized car in the courtyard, a stone's throw from where he told his story. It was a hot day in the courtyard, and there this diminutive man stood by choice. For 2 hours he spoke about his arrest and deportation. A tip-off from a friend alerted the family the Gestapo was headed. Put on long pants, Claude's mother told her son. Once at Auschwitz, 3 days after the sadistic confines of Montluc, the lines of women, men, and children were separated. Claude raced over to his mother. She pushed him back to the men. Again, he raced over to her. She pushed him back a second time. 3 hours later, she was marched off to the gas ovens. 9 months later, barely able to walk, he's released. Comes back to Lyon, lives in the same apartment where he grew up, his only memory of his mother. And then he says to us, my mother gave birth to me 3 times. When she gave birth to me, when she told me to wear long pants, and when she pushed me back. I asked him if it was his courage and spirit, that which kept him alive all those long months at Auschwitz, that enabled to tell us his story. Non. C'est mon responsabilité. Later in the afternoon, in the hours at the Centre d'Histoire, we met Guy Sanglarat, an 88-year-old survivor of the Résistance. And he wept. He told us a story about his grandfather who returns from being a POW. And he talks about his decision to fight with the Maquis in the hills. It would not have occurred to any of us sitting in either of those rooms that day to question these men about their memories. Pascal Coupeau of the Libération-Sud, would have us understand that. And he writes, "A word to young historians. When we read your studies about our underground world, they appear a bit cold." Like this room, right? "Without wishing to be pretentious, you should not be afraid of dipping your pens in blood. Behind each set of initials you describe with such academic precision, there are comrades who died." On 14 May 1997, the Aubrac launched a civil case in the 17th Division of the Paris Tribunal de Grande Instance, framing their case against Gérard Chauvy's work upon the Freedom of Press Act of 29 July 1881, seeking restitution for defamation of character. Babi launched his defense, they argued, on the backs of surviving victims by turning their accusations into claims of treachery, including Lucie and Raymond Aubrac. Neither Verger nor Babi, the Aubrac stated, had sought Raymond as a witness nor posed, quote, "the slightest intention, made the least remark, or produced any document capable of supporting this vile accusation, which remained extremely vague." Moreover, their erroneous accusations had been levied in Claude Beau's film, fostering similar incriminations. "There cannot," the Aubrac continued, "be any doubt that this book is aimed almost exclusively at the Aubrac and purports to use rigorous historical method to destroy their so-called legend as members of the Résistance." In the subsequent case of Chauvy and others versus France, and the European Court of Human Rights contesting the successful lawsuit brought by the Aubrac, Chauvy and his company alleged a breach by their right of freedom to freedom of expression in the matter of Aubrac, Lyon, 1943. And the court ultimately holds with them and determines that, in fact, they had been defamed. In the aftermath of the initial deluge against the Aubracs in general, and Lucie in particular, 19 resistors signed their names in opposition to Chauvy's charges. Geneviève de Gaulle, Germain Tillion among them. Setting bias and objectivity aside, we, like them, might consider the possibility to create and protect, quote, "a solidarity among surviving resistors from across the political spectrum." As they observed, despite the foibles of human weakness, at the very core of the heart is preservation for what, quote, "that we love and what we want to defend." Time passes, noted the aging Aubrac in 1997, and the resistance disappears before our very eyes. Evidence is trivialized and slandered, destroying, quote, "what was one of the most glorious pages of our history." As she observed, one must always conjugate the act of resistance in the present tense. Neither a journalist nor an historian, as Aubrac herself stipulates, she seeks to protect her memories on the basis of memory itself. Beyond the vagaries of memory, Lucien Febvre locates the living proof of, quote, "our version of events," and it is countersigned by thousands of sacrifices, unquote. In the recollection of the unimaginable days of strife, with the knowledge that can only come from unenableable human experience, Aubrac remained indomitable in her thought. "I don't want Babi and his friends," she recalls of those who died, "to insult us, or to trivialize with their slander the glorious and tragic history of the Résistance. The province of it may well rest in the hearts and minds of the resistors. Can we eschew the temptation to demand the axiomatic incorporation of archival records as a means of legitimating les périls de la Résistance? The archaeology that is called for in the instance of a journal intime is the archaeology of a psyche in a soul, not an historical dig. In the absence of the traditional historical and journalistic comfort of exactitude and verification, the obverse may be to consider the memories of those who shuddered in the hallways of Montluc prison on the way to Auschwitz. Or we might consider the lucky ones rescued along a Lyonnais road and listen to them. Is it, as Hannah Diamond and Claire Garrard ponder, an historical slide into hagiography? Might that, in fact, be a positive outcome? Or is it, as Lucie Aubrac shows, a mission yet to be fulfilled? For us, she writes, the Résistance, memory is our resource. Whenever racism or fascism tries to reappear, our watchfulness draws us together. We then become partners once again in a struggle that has been a source of pride. And for this, we also struggle to keep the young from forgetting. As Claude Bloch said, c'est mon responsabilité. Thank you.